Hey there, in this video I will be building this massive workbench. Now the overall dimensions of this workbench are 8 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 35 inches tall. Now it also has a 3-inch top, which provides a hard flat surface to work on top of. And this workbench also has a few features like the dog holes and the vises, and I will provide a link in the description below of all the tools and supplies that I used during this build. I hope you enjoy the video. Now, to avoid breaking the bank building shop furniture, Southern Yellow Pine is an affordable and durable wood to outfit your shop with, and that is what I will be using for this project. I began by breaking down these 2x12s at the miter saw, then I ran each board through the table saw. Now, while breaking down these boards, it's best to leave at least 1/4 of an inch longer and wider than what their final size will be. This will allow me to mill all the pieces down and not have to worry about taking off too much. After cutting the boards down to a rough dimension, I began the milling process. I ran each board through the joiner, followed by running them through the planer to get a nice flat surface on all 4 sides. Now it was time to begin gluing up what will make up the 4 legs and all of the stretchers. I grabbed some parallel clamps and began spreading the glue evenly across the boards. Then I added a few more clamps to ensure even pressure throughout each board. I repeated this same process for all of the legs and all of the stretchers. After letting everything dry, I began removing each piece from the clamps. As you can see here, to save on clamps, I was able to fit multiple legs in the same pair of clamps. Now it was time to mill each piece down to its final dimension. So I ran each piece through the joiner and the planer. This step also removes any glue squeeze out that had dried on the wood. I followed that up by cutting them down to their final length at the miter saw station. And there I have each piece that will make up the base. Now the joinery that I used for the base were loose tenon dowels. I grabbed my doweling jig and began drilling holes in the legs and the stretchers. This jig is very accurate and will provide a very strong joint. Now it was time to start assembling the base together. I started assembling each side by gluing and inserting the dowels into one leg, followed by pressing in the top and the bottom stretcher. I then finished off by applying the second leg. To get everything snug, I knocked down the leg using my hammer with a scrap piece of wood in between to avoid marring the leg. I then applied clamps and set this aside to dry. This is just one side of the base, and I repeated the same steps to make the second side. After those dried, it was time to finish assembling the base. With glue and dowels, I installed the front and rear stretcher to each side frame. Again, I grabbed my hammer and a scrap piece of wood to knock everything into place. I followed that up by grabbing some pipe clamps to put on those joints while they dried. Okay, they're dry. Now before I continue making the base heavier by adding more material, I needed to add leveling feet to the bottom of each leg. So I flipped the base over and found the center point of each leg. Then I used a Forstner bit followed by a regular drill bit to allow the leveler mount to sit inside of the leg, and then I added the 3 screws to the mount, followed by the foot itself. Then I flipped the table back over and began using my router with a roundover bit to soften all the edges of the base. This will prevent splintering and improve the overall appearance. After that, I needed to install some cleats for the bottom shelf. I did this with wood screws and leftover Southern Yellow Pine. I used a scrap piece of wood the same thickness of what the shelf will be to align the height of the cleat. I then began adding the shelf planks that I milled down. When I finished, I decided to test its weight capacity, and apparently it can hold 210 pounds, which will be plenty strong enough for storage. Now it was time to work on the tabletop. I ripped down 4 sheets of MDF to make the top. To join the sheets together, I began spreading glue across all the sheets while my son and I stacked them on top of each other. Now I wanted to add some screws, so I grabbed a straight edge and marked out a grid along the entire sheet to show where to place the screws evenly. After getting all 4 sheets flush with one another, I applied some clamps to prevent them from moving as I continued working on the top. I then started following my grid, drilling pilot holes with a countersink bit and came behind those with the screws. Now the screws will act as clamps for the 4 MDF sheets while the glue dries. Now it was time to add a protective border around the MDF top. I used southern yellow pine and started drilling some pilot holes with a countersink drill bit. With glue, I screwed each piece along all 4 edges of the top. At the same time, I ensured everything stayed flush with one another. Now to cover up all these screw holes, I grabbed a scrap piece of wood that had a similar grain pattern as the protective border and began drilling out plugs with a plug cutter bit. After plucking those loose, I now had all the plugs I needed to fill all of the screw holes. After knocking the plugs in with a mallet, I used a flush cut saw to remove the excess of the plug, followed by sandpaper to blend it with the protective border. To mount the top to the base, I used a Forstner bit followed by a regular drill bit to make pilot holes for lag screws. I inserted 2 lag screws on each side of the base. Now it was time to put a protective surface on the tabletop. I chose to use a laminate top mainly because the wood glue does not stick to it. And since I will be using this workbench for all of my projects in the future, I feel like this is the right choice. So I put my respirator on and began applying the contact cement with a foam roller to the MDF top and the bottom of the laminate sheet. After applying 2 coats and letting them dry, I placed some scrap pieces of wood across the workbench to keep it separated from the laminate sheet as I placed it on top. After lining up the sheet to the edges of the top, I began removing each scrap piece and setting the laminate sheet with my hand. I followed this up by using a J-roller, hitting every single inch on the top. I then went around the edges of the top with my router and a chamfer bit to soften the sharp edge. This will prevent the laminate from chipping and improve the overall appearance of the workbench top. So I bought a couple of vises to install on the side and the front of the workbench. While this step is optional, I figured I may as well add these since I'm this deep into the project. So I cut a piece of wood for each vise and tapered each end to match the same thickness of the workbench top. I used thick dowels and bought wooden curtain rod ends for the knobs. After installing the vises, I needed to drill some dog holes in front of them on the workbench top. So I began measuring out a pattern that would best accommodate me personally. There's really no right or wrong place to put these, it just depends on what best fits you. After marking where I wanted each hole, I used a portable drill press attachment along with a 3/4 inch spade bit and began drilling out each dog hole on the bench top, the edge of the top, and the legs. I then went back with my router and a chamfer bit to soften each dog hole opening, which will help when inserting bench dogs and holdfast along with preventing the laminate to chip out. Now it was time to apply a protective finish to the workbench, so I removed each vise and the bottom shelf planks. Now I've never been a big fan of light or tan colored wood. I've always liked dark rich color tones With that being said, I chose to stain my workbench the same color as my French cleat wall and miter saw station. I followed that up by adding polyurethane. After putting the vises and the bottom shelf planks back on, I needed to install these removable casters. Now, I'm not sure the overall weight of this workbench, but we may as well treat it as if it weighs 1,000 pounds. So these casters are vital if I plan on moving the workbench around the shop. If you are unfamiliar with what dog holes are used for, here are a few shots of why they are so versatile and beneficial to any woodworker. There is a large range of accessories to choose from that fit into these holes, and I prefer this method over the T-Track method any day of the week. And with that, the workbench is complete. Now, I believe every workshop should have a nice, durable workbench, and I plan on this one to last me for the rest of my life. If you are interested in building your own, I will leave a link for all the tools and supplies I used in this build in the description below. Hey, I hope you enjoyed the video, and before you go, I'd like to read some scripture to you coming from the book of Matthew, chapter 22, verses 36 through 40. And this is while the Pharisees are questioning Jesus. They asked, "Teacher, what is the most important commandment in the law of Moses?" Jesus replied, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments." Thanks again for watching.